Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Johan, Professor, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today in this module, we are going to introduce the field of practice, conflicts and social work. This particular module within this field of practice, conflicts and social work, is trying to look at understanding conflict, the concept of conflict. Being a preliminary module, we will also be looking at what do we mean by conflict, what are the origins and roots of conflict, and we will in the process we will look at different types of conflict and their causations. And at the end, towards the end, we will also be looking at how do identity significantly play in various situations of conflict. So this introductory module on conflict will be essentially to bring a kind of a foundational understanding of conflicts. Now, in order to start the discussion on conflict, first of all, we need to understand what do we mean by conflict. Quite often we talk different things about conflicts. It could be a fight, it could be a battle, it could be a struggle. Sometimes we also confuse it with disputes. Sometimes disputes are also talked about as conflicts. So we need to differentiate between these different ideas. So essentially, what do we mean by conflict? When we say conflict, we are trying to talk about something which is a confrontation between or across different parties involved in the conflict. So there is a confrontation which exists between or across parties which are involved in, that makes it the basis for a conflict. Now, what that confrontation could be on the basis of a disagreement or an opposition of interest or ideas. It could be on the basis of inability to achieve the aspirations of a particular group vis-a-vis another group. So this could be the conflict, the idea of conflict could be emerging from a disagreement or a kind of a confrontation between different parties which is involved in a daily kind of, a regular kind of interactions. So there is a perceived divergence of interest that makes the foundation of conflict. There is a perceived divergence. The divergence is always, there is divergence existing in all kind of human interactions. But the divergence lead to a kind of a regular kind of interactions which leads to a dynamics of conflictual interactions make a conflict happen. So one of the very, very important reason for conflict across the globe is growing sense of inequalities which exist. The society is highly becoming unequal. So this inequality is creating a sense of discontent among certain sections of the people vis-a-vis another section of the society. So the growing inequality forms the basis of any form of conflict. Now, is conflict a modern phenomenon? Not really. Actually, since the evolution, we could see the idea of conflict, and actually conflict is driving the process of evolution itself. If you look at Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest theory, it essentially talks about the kind of conflict or a struggle which happens across different species, and the species which are fittest only will survive. So there is a competition, there is a kind of a interaction which is happening to dominate, to survive in a fierce kind of a conflict which is happening. So Darwin's theory of evolution itself talks about a conflict which exists in the society, which is the basis for evolution of humankind. Now, let us look at how Sigmund Freud looked at a very the internal dynamics which happens within a person. So the internal dynamics of ego, superego is the basis of all the conflicts within. So individuals, probably that could be a conflict within an individual, but without that conflict, an individual cannot grow. So the basis of all human behavior, interaction, is based on this internal conflict which happens within a human being, which is the conflict of ego, id-ego, the interaction between id-ego and superego. So without that conflict, an individual cannot grow. There cannot be a situation of not having a conflict of internal ideas and ideologies and thinkings. A person cannot grow without that kind of a situation. Now, let us look at little more, in a broader sense of, social and economic and political dimensions of conflicts. Karl Marx, the basic theory of conflict is essentially emanating from the fact that the conflict is between the proletariats and the bourgeois. That conflict is between haves and have-nots. But this conflict is essentially, Marx's theory of conflict essentially talks about the fact that conflicts of this sort will bring about social change and improve human conditions. When we say this conflict will improve human conditions, it is because of the firm belief Karl Marx had in the belief that the proletariat could actually overthrow the powers, and that's the only way of human emancipation which Karl Marx is talking about. So, what we are essentially talking about in this entire discussion on conflicts is that conflicts need to be differentiated between short-term disputes. We could see small disputes, maybe even bigger disputes, and something like Kaveri water dispute. So that's a dispute between two states about sharing of a natural resource called water. So that's a dispute. There are certain things, ways and means one could try and negotiate and arrive at a agreeable solution. So disputes involves interests which are negotiable. That might not be the case with conflict. I will come to that a little later. So disputes involve interests which are negotiable, and a solution can be sought, at least partially meeting the requirements of parties in dispute. So there could be a possible solution which we could identify. There are certain negotiable needs, aspirations and interests which exist. That could be worked out, that could be talked about, that could be actually worked upon to arrive at a solution. Whereas if you look at long-term conflicts involve some non-negotiable interests. Look at the conflicts, let's take the example of Maoism. So there are certain probably non-negotiable aspects of this in terms of, from the point of view of the state. Violence in any form and killing people cannot be tolerated. And on the other side, if you look at the evolution of or the way Maoism has evolved from Naxalbari, it has evolved from a kind of a situation of deprivation, situation of lack of access to resources, lack of dignity, lack of capacity, lack of ability for people who have been working in the fields to prosper through their work. So when those kind of deep-rooted differences which exist in the society, that leads to a conflict, and of course that has taken different political and other forms of dimensions over the years when we moved from Naxalbari as an issue of resource sharing and all those kind of stuff. So when we compare between disputes and conflicts, we essentially say that there is a high stake of distributional questions which are involved in conflict. What do we mean by distributional questions? It could be on the basis of resources. So there are resources which are probably certain sections of the society, certain regions are appropriating resources. The very fact that the bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh into Andhra Pradesh and Telangana is also a distributional issue of resources. There are certain regions which are heavy in resources, but at the same time, developmental outcomes of these regions have been extremely skewed. So that led to a kind of a conflict, and of course, there has been solutions to this as well. So conflict doesn't mean that it doesn't have a solution, but at the same time, there are high stakes involved in conflicts, where our dispute could be, there could be stakes, but at the same time, there are certain negotiable conditions. So when we talk about conflict from this perspective, there are certain fundamental human needs. There are fundamental needs of security, there are fundamental needs of recognition, there are fundamental needs of safety and aspirations people may have. Those fundamental needs, those fundamental aspects of security, those fundamental aspects of recognition are not met. It could lead to a kind of a conflict. Let us take the example of caste conflict in the country. It is essentially, it is not between just because it is certain sections of the society are having increasing or dominating power, but that power is coming from the fact that certain sections of the society are marginalized, deprived and oppressed. So it is an aspect of it is an aspect of recognition. It is an aspect of dignity. It is an aspect of self-respect as well, beyond what we see as a everyday conflict in the case of caste conflicts. So these are ways in which one could look at conflicts in comparison to disputes. Now, having discussed some basic aspects related to conflicts, let us look at some of the theoretical perspectives which could be useful for understanding conflicts. One of the first thing could be that the functionalist, normally let's look at different traditions of looking at the conflicts. One is a functionalist who would argue that conflict are a result of poor communication, lack of trust and failure on the parties to address the needs and aspirations. Whenever we talk about conflicts, we talk about dialogue. Why are we talking about dialogue? Because we feel that the conflicts are emanating because of lack of communications, lack of trust, lack of ability of the parties to address the needs and aspirations. So the functionalists would argue that it is essentially conflicts are emanating from poor communications, lack of trust across different social groups or political groups which exist. Then there is a relational dimension. When I come to the second perspective, the humanist perspective, particularly focusing on the human relations and relational aspects of human behavior, that it talks about the conflicts are inherent part of human relations, human interactions, and that human relations are, these kind of conflicts are not probably always destructive. We need not consider conflict as negative experience. The conflicts can be positive as well. So conflict is as a part of the evolution process of the society, as I was mentioning about in the earlier section when I was talking about Darwin's survival of the fittest and all. So this is, as it has the potential to bring positive outcomes. When I say this, I would like to go back to the case of civil rights movement. Civil rights movement actually came from the strong belief that certain sections of the people didn't have certain liberties, or even for that matter women's movement across the globe, or the movement for LGBT rights. So these are coming from the fact that these conflict existed, these diverse experiences existed, but that conflicts led to much more a condition which improved upon the kind of relational inequities which existed. So humanists would argue that conflicts are not always negative. It can have positive outcomes as well. When I go a little further into this argument, interactionists would argue that conflicts are absolutely necessary. Conflicts are not only a part of the process of evolution, but it is also necessary for a healthy functioning and survival of human beings. So that conflict it's an interaction, it's a regular interaction which exists in the society, which could lead to certain conflicts, but at the same time, without those kind of interactional processes, society cannot evolve or society cannot have a healthy functioning as well. Finally, from the perspective of subjectivists would argue that conflict are manifested because of incompatible objectives. When do we say objectives? So I say, if you take the example of the Kashmir issue, there are incompatible objectives. Probably certain section of the Kashmiris would argue that they want greater autonomy, greater freedom, probably having a peaceful atmosphere. At the same time, the security forces or the Indian state would argue that there cannot be a situation where there can be regular conflicts or infiltrations or militant activities and things like that. In order to control that, there is a need for increasing militarization. So the people living in Kashmir, probably who do not have anything to do with the militancy and things like that, would argue that our objective is single. That single objective is to live in peace and have other developmental outcomes achieved. So these different perspectives will give us some kind of a framework for understanding how one can look at conflicts. None of these theoretical perspectives are complete in itself. What we are trying to do is to look at from different perspectives, so that different conflicts, when we analyze, we will be able to see resonance of some of these theoretical perspectives. Now, having done that, what we are trying to look at from some of the theories which explain or to understand conflicts, those perspectives which is broader conceptual, theoretical, philosophical perspectives. Coming down to understanding conflicts, one could look at a few theories which can explain. I'm not going into the basic theories of conflict theories by Marx and things like that, but in a daily life situations, how do we analyze conflicts from some of the theoretical propositions? One of the theory which talks about the human needs being the basis of conflicts. John Burton talks about conflicts. He explained conflict as a process which emanates from unsatisfied human needs. You have a human need for development, you have a human need for security, you have a human need for personal fulfillment, or your identity is not recognized. So there are different factors which impact one's functioning within the society. So very, very important aspect of conflict, John Burton say, is that if those needs are not met, it can lead to conflicts. Let me take the example of some of these, not so, when we say needs, it's not only the material needs in the sense, the food, livelihoods, shelter. So there are different basic needs. We're not talking about only basic needs. Basic needs are also important. If certain sections of the society are not able to fulfill their basic needs, that can lead to conflicts and violence and things like that. We have been seeing it all around the globe. But not only the basic needs, but also aspects of safety and security. That's also very, very important. If you look at Maslow's theory of needs hierarchy, it talks about from basic needs to other forms of needs, including self-esteem, security, safety, and all those kind of needs are also very, very important. Let me take the example of safety and security. If you look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, you could see that the Gaza Strip and West Bank, these are areas which are inhabited hugely by Palestinians. In the middle of those West Bank, you could see Israeli occupied territories, or maybe Israeli installations and occupied Israelis occupying those places, which are legally, of course, probably legally or whatever be it. But at the same time, the very fact that in the middle of Palestinian territory, if you have an installation which can even be used for combat and things like that, there is a huge sense of insecurity which is being created. So those kind of needs, when John Burton talks about needs, it includes all of these needs, includes safety, security, belonging. You might have heard about the conflicts in cities where migrants come to cities. There are conflicts emerging between the migrants and the locals. One of the situations where we have seen even in Mumbai, when the Biharis used to celebrate Chhat Puja, that where some sections of the society even objected to it or talked about it as something which is happening. They are creating a kind of a culture or something like that. So these kind of things were actually a sense of belonging for the people belong to that particular region. So they are celebrating their festival because they are connected to their culture and belonging and things like that. While they are celebrating a festival, they are actually expressing their cultural identity. So these belongings are also important. So these belonging becomes, if those belongings are not fulfilled, or needs of those belongings are not fulfilled, those things can also lead to kind of a conflict. So all of these processes, needs becomes extremely important for us to understand what are those needs which are existing, which are not fulfilled, which could continue to create conflicts or perpetuate conflicts. So this theory helps us to identify what are the negotiable needs, what are the non-negotiable needs. So for example, a person from a lower caste would, something which is non-negotiable, much more than the daily needs of work and livelihoods and things like that, is also the fact that something which is non-negotiable is his dignity. A person working in the field, much more than that, anything else, his dignity is much more important. Women who are working in the fields in various kind of situations, if their rights are violated, if their dignity is violated, that can lead to. So these are non-negotiable needs. So when we are talking about dealing with conflict, the reason why these kind of theoretical propositions are being discussed is that when we understand conflicts, analyze conflicts, we should be able to identify what are those negotiable needs, what are non-negotiable needs. Non-negotiable needs have to be definitely fulfilled. When we are looking at conflicts, we should not look at the conflict in its outward expression. It could be the position, two positions. Probably the Kashmiris want freedom, if that is one position, and Indian state want unity. So these are positions, but that's not the real conflict. The real conflict lies behind. There are shared interests and values. What are those shared interests? What are those shared needs? There could be needs of development, there could be needs of safety, security and things like that. So when we look at conflict from these kind of different theoretical propositions, we should be able to go beyond what is seen as obvious conflict. Now going further to another very interesting theoretical proposition is by Johan Galtung. He talks about structural violence. Structural violence, he says that the inequalities embedded in the social structure can lead to violence. What is that violence? Violence need not be physical violence. He talks about even violence if 2.5 billion people live in less than $2 a day. It is a violence. If there is a 30-year difference between life expectancy of Africans in comparison to people in developed nations, it is a violence. It is a violence. If 800 million people do not have access to healthcare, it is a violence. So violence doesn't necessarily mean that there is physical violence. These are structural violence. So structural inequities which are embedded within the social structures are also creates a condition of conflict. So these inequities which exist in the society can be explained through Johan Galtung's structural violence theory. So further, when we move, I have discussed a little while ago about this as well. There is conflicts. Louis Coser's theory of social function of conflict. Coser talks about conflicts are always not necessarily negative. I mentioned about this earlier. Conflicts can also have positive outcomes. So there is a need for understanding conflicts which has a social function. Conflict is a process of interaction, in behavioral exchanges which happens in the society. So when there is a conflict which exists, that means that there is an interaction happening. That interaction need not be always negative. So Coser talks about conflict which clears the air and allows for free behavioral expression of different entities within the society. So conflict can also create new norms. Say, for example, when the civil rights movement happened, or in the the anti-apartheid movement happened, it was a clear case of conflict. But that conflict led to new norms, that people could sit together, eat together, and travel together, or use the same kind of pool. These cannot be defined by the color of the skin. So those kind of positive outcomes are also possible. So there is a social function the conflicts are having. Now, another important theory which talks about conflicts is the game theory. The game theory, Schelling's game theory, Thomas Schelling's game theory, is essentially talking about the zero-sum game. Sometimes we consider conflicts as zero-sum game. What do we mean by zero-sum game? If there is somebody is losing, it's somebody, or somebody has to win, somebody else loses. That may not be always the case, because you may have a win-win situation. So the game theory or the zero-sum game idea of conflict can lead to a situation where there is only competition, and competition for achieving goals, and that is in a way inhibiting other people's aspirations to be achieved. So the Thomas Schelling's theory of game theory talks about that there are interdependent expectations, not always zero-sum kind of a situation. There are interdependent expectations which need not always lead to somebody is losing and somebody else winning. So there could be mutual dependency, there could be partnerships, there could be competitions. So these theories will give us some different perspectives to look at conflicts. It's not that any single theory can explain all the conflicts. That's not the idea. The idea is to look at how we can understand the causation of conflicts. The conflict are caused by various processes which happens in the society, which are emanating from unfulfilled needs, which are emanating from competitions, which are emanating from unequal power relations, which are emanating from unequal sharing of resources and things like that. So when we talked about the structural roots of conflict from the perspective of Johan Galtung-Structural theory, it also Christopher Michel talks about a triangular typology, where the key of any conflict become goal incompatibility. We talked about incompatible objectives. Similarly, the goal incompatibility form the key objective, and that key factor of goal incompatibility leads to certain attitudes. How these attitudes become firmed up, say for example, the goal incompatibility of the caste relations which exist in the society. There are certain sections of the society are expected to do only this kind of job. That becomes an attitude for a person who is having that kind of an idea about certain sections of the society do only this much, or they cannot do, or they cannot have land, they cannot have jobs of higher people, which higher upper caste people occupy. So those becomes an attitude which continues this process of conflict. Then that attitude becomes converted into behavior. You have an attitude, goal incompatibility leads to certain firmed up attitudes, and that attitudes contributes to formation of certain behaviors which are forming which are the factors leading to conflicts. Now, in all these things, when I was talking about conflicts, of course there are resource-based conflict, of course there are various kind of conflicts of political power and things like that. But one of the significant thing in the post-Cold War era of conflicts is identity. The identity plays a significant role in conflicts. So the concept of identity has become the prism to analyze contemporary social and political life. So identity, so when we talk about caste conflict, we are talking about an identity issue. When we talk about communalism, we are talking about an identity. When we talk about the recent Gorkhaland agitation which is happening in West Bengal, that's also about identity and their ability to not to protect their identity and things like that. So identity becomes significant factor of making societies, forming it into different camps and fighting for each other, and that has become face of one of the significant dimensions of conflict in 21st century. So when identity are threatened, people react, and that leads to conflict. So threat to identity can lead to destructive conflict which exists in society, which we can see it in all the kind of different kinds of conflicts which we are talking about. So this is very, very important for us to understand that identity plays a significant role in conflicts in present day society. So having understood the theories of conflict, understanding theoretical perspectives and things like that, let us also briefly look at what are the different types of conflict which we are talking about. There could be different conflict at different levels. One could be the intrapersonal conflict, which I was talking about when I was saying about Freud's conflictual intrapersonal conflict. It is essentially talking about the conflict within your ideas and your aspirations and things like that. There could be a conflict. There could be an interpersonal conflicts between two individuals having different kind of ideas and different kind of ideologies, different kind of goals. There could be interpersonal conflicts. There could be intergroup conflicts. The groups, different groups having, probably when we talk about different identity groups, ethnic groups, even in Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese and the Tamils, there are intergroup conflict which exists. That has taken to bigger levels of conflict which involves the state as well. There is intra-group conflict which happens. The Nagas conflict is a very, very interesting example of intra-group conflict. Nagas forming more than around approximately 40 different tribal groups forms something called the Naga identity. Within Naga identities, Naga conflict started with demanding for a separate Nagaland. But later, small fractions within the Naga society has formed, and then there are different splinter groups within Naga movements which happen. So there are inter-group conflict which can also happen. And much more, we are hearing about a lot of conflicts within the nation states. Within the state level states or the state level conflicts, which could be, probably the Kashmir conflict, which could be the Maoism, which could be Gorkha. So these are all national level conflicts which we are dealing with. Even though it is in a particular region, it becomes an aspect of a nation state to deal with. And then comes to international conflicts, which you could see it in Europe, in several other parts of the world. There are international conflicts which involves borders and all those kind of issues as well. Now, to sum up, what we have tried to do from this session, this module, is that we try to understand how do we understand conflict? What is the concept of conflict? Is it dispute is conflict, or conflict is different from dispute? What are those kind of roots of conflicts which will differentiate between the conflict and disputes? We also discussed about different theories to look at, to understand, to explain conflicts in a much more nuanced way. There are different factors which contribute to conflicts have also been briefly discussed, and finally we looked at identity as a very, very significant aspect of contributing to conflicts, and different typologies of conflicts are discussed here. In order to get further inputs on the conflict, there are quite a good number of readings which are given. These readings will help you to understand, just to get a sense of introduction to this conflict module. Thank you so much.